Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my 2021 reading statistics video. Hilariously, my sister, who finds most booktube videos, definitely including my own, really boring, loves the statistics videos and was asking me the other day, when are you making your statistics video? So thanks to pressure from her, I'm filming this. According to Goodreads, I read 194 items last year. According to Storygraph, 185. Storygraph has a few fewer comic book items and some of the poetry bits they don't have. You can certainly add things yourself on there, but I'm using these apps for the sake of ease of use, and if I wanted to add things, I would just be tracking on my own, so I don't bother, so that's why there's a 10-item difference there. According to Goodreads, the shortest book that I read this year was an Agatha Christie short story, which was Agatha Christie's The Bond Robbery. I track all of these separately because my library has them all listed separately, both as ebooks and audiobooks, and most of the ones I actually listen to as audiobooks, which are 40 minutes long each. And so if I want to keep track of which ones I've listened to, they each get their own check mark, even though I think a lot of people would consume these as part of a collection, and they would not be individual items, but that's where we are. The longest book that I read this year was not actually that long. It's barely 500 pages, and that's C.S. Friedman's This Virtual Night, which is 20 years later, a sequel to This Alien Shore. It's a lot of fun, but it didn't have the social commentary that This Alien Shore had, so I was disappointed even though I did like this. That doesn't matter because we're just talking about page count here. Actually, to jump back to the number of books read, this year has felt like, not necessarily a bad reading year, but sort of a light or sloppy reading year for me, just because I tend to be more structured and read while I'm doing something else, and because of the state of the world, I haven't been doing things. However, the reason I still hit almost 200 books is because the average book length that I read in 2021 was just 174 pages. Now, all of those Agatha Christie short stories and the few comic book floppies that I tracked through here do throw that off slightly, but this definitely was a year in which I consumed a lot of shorter form material. Even a lot of the novels that I read were borderline novellas, which I enjoyed. That's not because, again, I don't think there's any moral or social value to one or the other, but I just think it's kind of an interesting point. Yes, if we're going to do the most popular and least popular thing, the most popular book that I read this year was Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which was not what I thought it was going to be. It is one part Holocaust memoir and one part psychobabble, and I had expected it to be one or the other and less of a mishmash. And according to Goodreads, I was the only person who has shelved Soulscape, which is Badahar Baruter's kind of experimental comic book, so that was funny. I always think it's hilarious just because normally when I'm the only person who's read something, it's usually a poetry collection, so that it was a comic this time is kind of funny. The highest rated book that I read on Goodreads was Yasmin Yıldız's Beyond the Mother Tongue, the Post-Monolingual Condition, which is great, but I think it has a high rating because it's kind of an academic book, and I think only about 5 people have read it, and everybody's given it 5 stars. I'm going to jump over to Storygraph and pull their stats, which, to be honest, I don't love because a lot of them are kind of meaningless to me. They give you that statistic for mood, and that honestly means nothing to me. I don't think that's useful at all. Similarly, the pace, I don't see the point of tracking either of those things. We do go back to the average page count, though. 16% of the books I read were over 300 pages, but 84% were under 300 pages, which sounds about right because, as I said, it has been a short kind of year. My fiction to nonfiction ratio, according to Storygraph, is 54% nonfiction to 46% fiction, which sounds like a higher percentage of fiction than usual, but I think some of that is purely because, one, during all of the mystery-themed readathons that I did, and there were 3 during the year, I did, as I said, consume a bunch of these Agatha Christie short stories, which are each tracked separately, and also I had a couple of comics that I had gotten through Comixology, and because it's linked to the Kindle, it does automatically track those, and normally I would wait for a trade to track them, so I think because of the digital floppies and because of the Agatha Christie short stories, that upped the fiction, because there were chunks of that. Again, I don't love the genres that Storygraph uses, but because they do this. I didn't pull it myself this year, which I usually do. For example, my number one genre, according to them, is comics, which I'm going to talk about format statistics that I pulled myself later, which is a good chunk of my reading, but I don't call that a genre because obviously if you read a work of comics journalism and a superhero comic, those are very different genres, so I don't love that. My second genre, though, was memoir. Third was graphic novel, which again, we're back to the comic thing. Why is that separate? A fourth was poetry, which is another reason the books are short this year. And then history, short stories, classics, LGBTQIA+, which again, that's not a genre. That's a demographic category. Why is... Anyway. Then mystery, then literary, then historical, then essays, then biography, politics, crime, autobiography, science fiction, young adult, which is an age category, not a genre, once again, fantasy, race, art, feminism, travel, thriller, science, romance, horror, nature, self-help, psychology, philosophy, gender, sociology, children's, magical realism, sports, religion, play, contemporary, reference, food and drink, which I suppose is correct. Another issue that I have with Storygraph is that they have fewer editions of books. So according to these statistics, 90% of the books that I read were print, 7% were ebooks, and 3% were audiobooks. And I feel like there were slightly more ebooks than that. I keep complaining about the things that Storygraph pulls, but I'm going to say something positive this time. I like the books and pages read month by month. I think that's fun. You can see how the 30 books in January is something I try to do every year. I don't take reading goals terribly seriously. I set mine to 100 every year, but because I read so many smaller items, I always assume I'll probably get around double that, but I'm not disappointed if I'm not, or if it's slightly under. I don't care. I know some people are stressed out by that and will ignore it or set it to 1 item or 5 items, but I mean, it's for yourself. It's not a competition. I feel like a lot of people were traumatized by one of those things they do at libraries for kids where they get a pizza if they've read X number of books. Too many people didn't win their pizza or something, I think. Apparently my average star rating last year was 3.72. We'll talk about the stuff that I actually pulled for myself. The one number that my sister asked me to look up, so I'm going to mention that first, was how many of the books that I read were published in 2021. And so the answer to that is 13%. And the great bulk of the books that I read were books that were published in this century that we're in now. There isn't a huge difference from the numbers that I pulled at my mid-year statistics video, so I'll link to that. It's this side, isn't it? Above or below or both. If you're curious about that, and if you're curious about that, you're probably my sister. In terms of where the books came from, 58% of the books that I read came from the library, which is extremely low for me. Most years that number is 80 or 90%. And I think this is exclusively because during the past 2 years I've bought so many more books than I normally would. Kind of guilt into, you need to support all of these booksellers and authors and whatnot. Yeah, I just bought an extraordinary number of books over the past 2 years, and now I feel like I need to be reading them. So, I mean, I know for some people, almost 60% of your books coming from the library would be good library usage, but for me, that is extremely low. And 1% of the books that I read were ARCs. I fell very behind on keeping up with things I'd requested on NetGalley, and I request very few things. I managed to finish one of the outstanding ones that I had the last week of the year, but it was a year in which I read far more owned books than I normally would have. I keep saying that. It was still a minority of books that I read. The majority were still library books. So format or style. So about a quarter of the books that I read were comics format. About 10% were poetry. About 12% were short stories. About 33% were long-form prose. Just under 10% were essay collections. Around 5% were mixed media type books, which is higher than that normally is. 1% were plays, and 1% were photo books. In terms of the languages that I read books in, I did not do a great job at my plan to increase the number of books that I read in languages other than English and French. So that made up less than 1% of my reading. My reading was still 90% English and 10% French, with this small less than 1%. Although less than 1% is better than 0%, so maybe we'll call that a bit of a success, but not really. In terms of the languages the books were originally written in, so this is regardless of whether I read them in the right language or in translation. Oh, I saw somebody else talking about this and now I can't remember who it was. I will note it below if I remember. I'll look it up and note it below, about how one should not be reading a book in translation if you have the ability to read it, both in terms of language knowledge and in terms of the accessibility of that language's copy of the book. But sometimes it's just easier because of price, or there are holds on one version at the library and not on the other. So I didn't track that, but it might be interesting to track in the future. So around a third of the books that I read were originally written in languages other than English. So of that third, 13 of the books were originally written in French, 7 in Arabic, 7 in Bosnian/Croatian, 6 in German, 6 in Japanese, 5 in Turkish, 3 in Italian, 2 each in Persian or Farsi, Russian, Albanian, and Greek, and 1 each in Polish, Danish, and Macedonian. All right, author nationality gets a little tricky just because of the kind of thing that I'm interested in. I do read a lot of authors who are dual or triple citizens, or who live in one country because they are in exile from their original country, and I'm not going to change their nationality because of politics. That gets uncomfortable. So my imperfect solution to the country tracking problem is to include both people who are obviously of the country they're writing about, and also people who are writing about countries from which they are less than 2 generations removed, because I think that solves a bit of the problem in that there are some countries from which a lot of people are living in exile, and you don't want to dismiss that experience as something that you want to look at. But also there are a number of countries where very few things have been translated, or only items from very specific groups have been translated, again, often for political reasons. So being mindful of that, I thought this is workable for me. And on this map, the countries in blue are ones in which I had books read this year. I really need to get better at reading Australian authors because I very rarely do. I do generally try to avoid reading more than a third books from US-based authors, just because I feel like when you are reading in the English language, it is so easy to end up reading almost nothing but authors who live in the US or are US citizens. And so I try to keep that under a third, and I was at 29% this year, which I think is fine. I don't know if that'll be higher or lower this coming year, because I did volunteer to judge for the BookTube prize, and not for the general fiction, but for nonfiction and translated work. So I think translated work will mostly not be US Americans, but the nonfiction category might be a lot of US stuff, so we will see. Interestingly, my percentage of UK authors and Canadian authors that I read this past year in 2021 was lower than usual, because it was 8% UK authors and only 12% Canadian authors, which is surprisingly low. So that leads us into the demographic categories. In terms of gender, 93 of the authors that I read were male, 76 were female, 4 were non-binary, and the remaining were works in which either it was an essay collection with both male and female authors, or it was a comic with authors and artists of various genders. That was interesting just because usually I tend to accidentally get closer to a 50-50 split, and actually at the mid-year point it was quite close to a 50-50 split. So I think the heavier male percentage is exclusively because I was reading as many political prisoner memoirs, and certainly female ones written by female authors exist, but sometimes you have to look harder for it. I've seen a couple of people lately comment that they don't think gender is worth tracking just because of the availability of everything, but I think that varies a lot when you're looking at material from certain countries, and also when you're looking at very specific experience memoirs. I do find there's an access issue to a certain extent there that can be worth being conscious of. So I know some people track sexuality of authors, and that is not something I'm doing, because while some authors are upfront about things or will comment in passing about that, for most authors, that involves digging into who's this person's partner and then making assumptions, which frankly I think is gross. I also don't track race in the way that I think a lot of people who read within a single country do, because I don't think that that's super useful. I think it is more useful to look at anything within a single country. Just to clarify that a bit, What I'm talking about is, let's say you read a lot of Russian writers, but none of them are Tatar, and you read a lot of Chinese writers, and none of them are Tibetan. I think what's missing when people use a broad American racial categorization of white and Asian, or even just of white and people of color, I think it hides a lot of the specific categories that exist in other countries, and it makes people feel like they're doing a better job of reading the world than they actually are. And then if you're reading in the Eastern Mediterranean, say, depending on where you are, you may think that this is people who are all the same color. You may put them in 2, 3, or 4 different categories, and it's all very arbitrary where those lines are drawn. So I think trying to force the world into categories like that doesn't work. But again, I think if you're reading mostly American authors, it does make more sense. So I'm not arguing against it in general. I just think in a more international sense, having more granularity is always going to be a better choice. Of the Canadian authors that I read, a third of them were of South Asian heritage, and around 8% each were of First Nations or Métis heritage, and a similar percentage for East Asian, a similar percentage for West Asian, and for French Canadian. And then I had one-offs for Anglo-Canadian, Vietnamese Canadian, Filipino Canadian, and Croatian Canadian. I am not a fan. I know a lot of people like to do something that's will lump all Asians together or all Europeans together, but I don't think the cultural space of, say, a Vietnamese Canadian writing in French and a Filipino Canadian writing in English, or an Anglo-Canadian writing in English, or a French Canadian writing in French, are really in the same category if you're looking at what kind of cultural experiences and regional experiences, which I think is really the point. I did want to add one kind of funny national thing. Of the UK authors that I read, 37% of them were Agatha Christie, so, which I always think is funny. I feel like I should have pulled something else as well, and now I can't remember what that was, but I think I'm just going to end it here. If you've made a statistics video and I haven't commented on it yet, let me know so I can watch it, because a lot of people were posting New Year's wrap-ups and I may have missed a couple in there, because I do love a good statistics video. And also let me know what else you track that I don't track, because I'd be curious to hear about that. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.